Hello and welcome to episode 139 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, it's great to see you back. How are you doing?
I'm good, Andy. It's good to be back as ever. It's been a busy week. I don't know about you. You're probably like the rest of the world, fed up of GDPR and all sorts of things linked to it. But
do you know what? I found that in the last week or so, this will really date the podcast. In a couple of years, people won't even have a clue what we're talking about. But we're talking about it this week because everyone is dealing with GDPR this week. What I found is I'm now judging companies based on how prepared they've been. Like the companies that have been sending emails the last thing on the Thursday night, on the 24th or whatever, just before the deadline hit, I think to myself, You've not been planning for this. I'm not sure what sort of an organisation you are. So I'm kind of ranking certain organisations on their preparation skills, and I shouldn't be doing that because obviously it's a big old thing, and a lot of organisations are struggling with it. How have you been dealing with it? I suppose you, as a business yourself, you've had to take action, have you?
Well, the thing with GDPR is that it's a huge positive for consumers because it empowers them to have control of their data and how it's used. And so we've had to do some bits in the background, but we are almost we were GDPR compliant before the sort of rules came in, because what it really was saying that people only wanted to hear from you if they asked to hear from you. And of course, there's been lots of ways that companies have acquired people's emails and data, etc. So for a lot of companies, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, because if you're already doing things the right way, it wasn't too much of a big task. But, I mean, we did have to do things like update policies, privacy policies, give people the ability to be forgotten, all these things which are fundamentally a good thing. But there is a big frustration with the whole GDPR as a wider piece that I will just moan about briefly. And it's a bit of a warning. We've spent years telling consumers not to click on links that are in emails that seem to be from their bank or from a company they recognise. And that's because of that phishing scam. So phishing with a PH. So that's whereby you'll get an email from a scammer or fraudster that will appear to maybe be from your bank. But there might be little clues that it's not, because they often have mistakes in them. But they're increasingly more sophisticated. They're not all glaringly obvious. And they want you to click on the link, effectively. Whatever ruse they use. Maybe they say you need to reset your password, or there's a statement or something like that. So you click on it, and then that enables them, to start to acquire information from you, because they normally take you to a replica site of one that you're expecting to see, and then you enter your password details and they capture that, and then they can go on their merry way, capture information from you, and possibly use that to steal your identity or even money. Now, the reason why it's frustrating is because in the last week, it seems to be, that's when the peaks happened. All these companies have panicked about the GDPR rules, and I'm assuming everyone knows what GDPR is anyway. It'd be very difficult to not have heard about it, but they've panicked as they started sending emails saying you've got to click on this link to re-sign in and re-register your interest. But of course, the scammers out there, and the phishing scammers in particular, have been using that. It's been a field day for them, so they're sending out emails that seem to be from these companies as well, saying click on this link. Of course, everybody's blindly clicking links, and it's therefore going to probably have it will mean there'll be a whole wave of people who unfortunately have now been trained to start clicking on links randomly from anybody that they think they sort of recognise in their email inbox, and it'll probably lead to some problems further down the line. So that's a big disappointment, and part of the disappointment really is that a lot of that email sending wasn't really required under the rules of GDPR. I mean, we spent a lot of time, money looking into it, speaking to other big companies who were dealing with it. And I think there was an overkill. People overreacted. To use a comparison, do you remember the Millennium Bug, Andy, when the whole world was going to end? And I remember being at a party New Year's Eve. I was actually in Holland at the time, and there was a world map where they were going to show you all the things going wrong. I think the only thing that appeared was a ship off the coast of Africa kind of stalled or something. There was nothing really went wrong. And I think the overreaction to GDPR has been a big negative. And one of the things is that people don't realise that investment platforms and other companies have spent millions trying to work out how to deal with GDPR. And as a result, who do you think is going to pay for that? They're not going to do it in some sort of charitable way. It'll end up being consumers that the cost is passed back onto. So, yeah, GDPR as a concept, brilliant. I think the way it was dealt with by lots of companies perhaps was slightly overreacting, but those that probably did overreact slightly maybe needed to, because they were holding data and had people's contact details where they hadn't probably given consent in the past. But anyway, so that was GDPR. I mean, I largely ignored all the emails I got because I thought I'm going to have a clean inbox. Hopefully, this stops me having to get rid of them. But I was getting contacted by people I never knew I was apparently in contact with. And one company, actually Fidelity, I'll name them, they even wrote to me twice. And I was talking about it on Twitter. They wrote to me via letter in the post to say, basically, please don't go. So, it went to some extremes there. So, dealing with that. And but apart from that, it's been a good week. And one of the things that I would mention is that last week we had the World IBD Day, and that's inflammatory bowel disease. Now, anybody who listens to this podcast knows I talk about Crohn's disease from time to time because I have it and had lots of problems over the years. But it was World IBD Day, and so if you do nothing else after listening to this podcast, Google colitis or Crohn's disease and just have a read about it, because it helps raise awareness, because there are a lot of people in the UK who suffer from it. And in a couple of weeks I'm doing a 10k charity walk for Crohn's and colitis, actually, which will be fun. So if anyone's doing that as well, then do let me know and I'll say hello.
Good on you. I saw you shared on Facebook your personal story. I think it's really good that the various organisations give people to do these cool little infographics that can give you some nice, really, well, I say nice, obviously it's awful, but to raise awareness, nice bite-sized nuggets of how exactly it's affected you in terms of how many operations, what the main symptoms that you suffer, what you want to get out of it. I think it was really good, and it did certainly raise my awareness. I saw it on Twitter and I shared it as well, and as did my wife. So it's certainly doing its thing, and you and your fellow sufferers, Damien, I hope that there's more money invested into it and that people in future have to suffer far less, or try and wipe it out if we can. Is there any chance of that happening in the future? I don't know how genetics work and all this kind of thing. Well, could it be eradicated?
We live in hope. There's no cure. So although it sounds like a disease, and it's not, it's really a condition. It's something that your body...
Did I call it a disease?
No, it is a disease. It's called Crohn's disease, but people, when you say it, they think, oh my God, am I going to catch it? But it's basically immuno disease where your body overreacts in your stomach and cause all sorts of problems. But anyway, we won't go on about that.
I'm normally the one for the overreacting. Such a shame that you suffer.
Right, before we move on with the show, couple of quick things. I want to say hello to Phil in Jersey, Ian in Thailand. We're very global these days, Andy. Chris Anchor, and anybody else who's written to me in the last week. They are the three that jumped off the page, who've been talking to me on Twitter, email, various different things. And one of the pieces this week is inspired by Mark. I won't give his surname because I talk a bit about the email he sent to me, so I want to keep his privacy in a very GDPR friendly way.
Great, so we're almost 10 minutes in and we haven't told the listeners exactly what they're getting in this week's podcast, but that's okay. We've got something else before we start. We had a review, didn't we?
We had 2 reviews. Right, I'm going to read them very quickly. There was MZ in UK. Great, only started listening to the podcast half a year ago, but was instantly drawn into the knowledge and practical help it provides. Keep up the good work, well done. And Peacock Review said, awesome. Very informative and simple to understand whilst being down to earth and funny. That's you, Andy. All wins when talking about money is involved. Cheers. Right. Send us your reviews. We'll read them out. On with this week's podcast. Now, the 3 pieces, Andy, I'm going to talk about are, one of them is related to dementia, actually, and more importantly, lasting powers of attorney, when, how and why. I want to talk about something that Mark, one of the listeners, sent in an email, talking about exit fees and overcharging and what to watch out for. And finally, investing for your children. I was asked about how would I invest? What would I invest in if I was putting in a regular amount of money for my kids?
Excellent stuff. Should we start with the dementia piece?
Yeah, the dementia piece came about because it was Dementia Action Week, which is organised by the Alzheimer's Society. So we had IBD day, and we got a whole week dedicated to dementia. But quite rightly, I mean, I know personally of people who've been affected, and I've seen it firsthand, and the impact.
It's absolutely awful. Got a very good friend of mine whose his mother is suffering right now, so my thoughts are with them and anyone else who suffers from that. It's just awful. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
No, but it's. I think most people will know somebody who is suffering or has suffered, but particularly their carer as well. So maybe their partner, and the impacts it has on them, because it has a lot of health and financial impacts. And what I wanted to talk about is the fact that when people obviously have Alzheimer's, and they start to lose the mental capacity to run their own affairs or look after themselves, then that starts to pose a problem because they can't make their own decisions. So what can you do about that? Because obviously you can get to a point whereby somebody could, if they lost their mental capacity, the dependents or partner, they could lose access to funds for the person's care, or they could lose the inability to sell a property, some kind of fund, or even you could get the extreme case that a spouse could lose access to joint bank accounts because the person suffering can't give their consent or won't. So how do you get around this? And it's called a lasting power of attorney. Now, the way they work is that you can set them up in advance. You don't have to wait for somebody to develop an illness, so like Alzheimer's or anything like that. The aim is to do it before there is a problem. So somebody has to be of sound mind and actually have the mental capacity to be able to sign a lasting power of attorney. So what it will say is that obviously at some point in the future, if they lose the capacity, they will nominate the person or people who will be able to make decisions on their own on their behalf. Now, there are two types. There's one for health and welfare, and there is one for property and financial affairs. Now, the reason I also wanted to do this piece, because there were some alarming statistics. 850,000 people are suffering with dementia or Alzheimer's at the moment. A new person is diagnosed every 3 minutes in the UK as well. So this is about planning ahead of something like that happening, especially if you have parents or you are a parent yourself and you are worried about this sort of thing happening. So a lasting power of attorney is basically a form that gives people the ability to run your affairs, health or property. Now, they only cost £82, and you can find out how to set them up. They're relatively easy if you go to the gov.uk website /power-of-attorney. And like I said, the only thing that you have to be is you have to be of sound mind. Now, that's a relatively low cost for something that could, in the end, save a lot of heartache and hassle going forward. Because what would happen if you didn't have a lasting power of attorney? So somebody did unfortunately lose the mental capacity to make their own decisions. Well, then you'd have to apply to the Court of Protection to be able to take the responsibility of those decisions. And that can take months, and it can also cost north of £1,000 to do so. So there was plenty of incentive to ponder whether you should be thinking about lasting powers of attorney. Now, one thing that people wonder is that if somebody had a lasting power of attorney, so let's say you'd filled one out for somebody else, and there was that person who was going to be able to take care of your affairs, they might worry that that person could change their will or something like that. And the answer is that they can't do that. So even if you have a lasting power of attorney for somebody, you can't change their will or make a new one. Now, there are odd exclusions. If somebody doesn't have a will, you can make a sort of a statutory will, but that's a sort of a minor point. But you still have to go through the Court of Protection to do that, so there is a lot of protection there. But one other thing to bear in mind, that the lasting power of attorney does have inheritance tax implications, because you would have to get the Court of Protection's approval if the person who had the lasting power of attorney, so who was taking control of the person's affairs, if they were to receive a gift from that person, a monetary gift.
Right.
And you can kind of see why that would be, because they wouldn't, like we said, they can't change a will, but giving themselves funds from a person's estate could obviously have implications. It could be, in some cases, done fraudulently. But the other reason is there are reasons why you would want to do this. I mean, for example, it could be part of a inheritance tax planning. So it would be agreed with financial advisors, these are the best things to do, that you're going to pass money on to these people from this person's estate. And you may be, say, the son or daughter of a parent, and you have the power of attorney, and you would naturally be a beneficiary, but you would have to go and get the Court of Protection's approval for that. So you can do it, there's nothing wrong with it, but you just have to bear in mind, and what they will probably do in those instances is make sure that the person in question, so the person who, for example, might have Alzheimer's, has enough funds to survive or pay for their care. So they may put a limit on, for example, that the person has to have before you can then start receiving gifts. So lasting power of attorney is particularly relevant in Dementia Action Week, and something that's worth reminding everybody about. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries, and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers in the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service, let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Okay, Damien, so investing for your children, you can give us something on this?
Yeah, someone just asked my opinion, and as with all things, there are lots of ways in which you could invest. There's some of it is actually a personal choice, so there's personal preference. There's no right or wrong way. But I was asked,
are we specifically talking about investing for children or saving for children? I know it's a...
No, you're right. You're right to question it. It's about investing, and this person had decided to put money in a junior ISA and is doing that at the moment. And the question they asked me is that the thing is with doing regular amounts, they're investing between £500 and £1,000 a year, and they were doing it regularly, and they were pondering the sort of risk they should take or what strategy they should follow if they are investing for their children and with a term of sort of 15 to 18 years. Now, like I said, this is just my view. I'm not putting my view on anybody else and saying this is how you have to do it and it's not advice. But if I was in that position, what I would do is, the first thing goes without saying, I would get a product, because this person had a junior ISA, I'd go with one that has the lowest costs. And there are a number of entities out there that are starting to provide low cost junior ISAs. They're only just coming in. The major platforms have done junior ISAs for years, but keep an eye out. So keep costs low. That's obviously the main thing, because you know you're going to have an investment term that's going to probably be 15 to 18 years, and the compound effect is huge. Now, I would take a lot of risk, and if you know anyone who knows me knows I'm not a gung-ho reckless person, and I would always probably be not cautious, but I'd be very careful with the risk that I take. And now I say I'm taking high risk, that doesn't mean I'm being reckless. I'm not gambling. But what I would do is that if you are dripping in regularly and it's a small amount, in order for the growth to be almost worthwhile, you need to take more risk. You've got a long enough time frame to take that risk, because if you think back to the dot-com boom that happened in 2000, it popped and the market tumbled hugely. I forget the amounts, but it's probably about 40%. So if you go back and look at a chart, it looks like the biggest tidal wave that's ever existed, and it goes down and it started to pick up again in about 2002, 2003, and then it rose into the financial crisis until the wave crashed again, and now we're back up onto that wave. So you've got these huge peaks and troughs, and that period was 18 years. And so even though the market could crash a huge amount and you are taking, say, quite a bit of risk, and when I'm talking about risk, I'm basically meaning stocks and shares, you've got time for it to recover. And so therefore you don't have to focus so much on the low risk side of things, and I wouldn't. So I would manage risk, I'd be mindful of it, but I would go 100% into equities because of their age and how young they are. Now, as time goes on, once I get to the period of, say, 5 years away from the period where I think they would either receive the money or I would want to use the money for something, that maybe pay for a university or whatever, I would start to reduce the risk that's being taken. So I would start to knock down the equity content and start to introduce some lower risk assets. And I mean, ultimately you would probably want to move to cash, because if you get to a period where you know how much you've got and it's achieved an aim which you're after, so that might be to cover a certain amount of fees at university, there's no point taking any more risk. And that is what they call in the sort of trade, it's lifestyling. You'll see things like lifestyling funds, and what they do is, as you move towards a particular retirement date or something, they start to move out of higher risk assets into lower risk assets, but you can do it yourself. So what does that mean when I say high risk stuff? I mean, of course, that means emerging markets, that means Asian equities, tech shares, UK equities, US equities. But to give somebody a steer, now again, this isn't a definitive recommendation or anything like that. If you look at a good example of a 100% equity fund, now Vanguard do one, and it's called the Life Strategy Fund. And I built a calculator. If you go to calculators.moneytothemasses.com/investment. Now, there was a calculator that was built that took account of how, for example, the Vanguard funds invest and other ETFs, and looked at how they vary the equity content, where they invest it in terms of UK, maybe America, Europe, etc., and based on about how much risk you want to take. And so I've sort of put that all in to create a tool that people could put in how old they are and the risk they want to take, and it might suggest a portfolio. And using that, and assuming that I was going to take a lot of 100% equities and I had a long investment time frame as described, it threw out around about a quarter of your money would be in UK equities, about 13-15% would be in European, about 10% in Japan, and then it would have between 3-5% in sort of Asian emerging markets. But the biggest chunk was almost half of your money was in North American equities, so US equities. And the problem is that that's okay, but that's because it's done largely by market cap. So the American stock market is enormous. So that's how these funds work. So what I would say take from that is you want to be globally diversified. You don't want to just do it on the UK. Of course, you could just take an equity tracker. There's no problem doing that if you really wanted to, and just do that. But you'd be picking one market and basing upon it. So I would diversify across a range of them, with the key ones probably being US equities, UK equities, and then with Japan and Europe, and then some of the lower risk stuff. But I would, being me, probably notch up the emerging market a little bit, because in 18 years' time, the world is going to be a very different place to what we inhabit now, Andy. So I hope I've answered that question. One thing I would say is that when you have two children, there's always that thing about, well, what happens if one has more than the other? Because they're at different ages when they were born. And it's something that I've pondered, because if I do this for my children, I think I would have to try and top them up slightly as we went along. I'd have the same assets, but I think I'd have to be mindful of how well one was doing, see if I could try and balance it. But that's just the luck of the draw.
Or you could just pick a favourite and just go with that. Or if they misbehave, you could say to one or the other, well, you're not getting your top up. I'm not going to top up yours this week. Or no, I think you could use that as a bit of a stick to beat them with. Not literally, obviously.
Oh, good. Well, I'll bear that in mind, Andy.
Good stuff. And we're going to finish off, as you mentioned earlier, with a question from Mark talking about exit fees specifically.
Yeah, I mean, this was... It was, I think it was spurred by, we've been talking about the idea that if you don't keep an eye on things, so your mortgage, if it runs out of its fixed period, or an offer you have, how how much it costs you for every week you delayed. We covered that, I think, last week in the podcast. And Mark wrote in and he was saying about how he'd effectively been stitched up by a couple of entities which I'll name, and it was only for him keeping an eye on it and double checking that they didn't get away with it, as it were. So he actually caught them out. But before I mention it, I must say, do you remember last week I talked about a magazine? It was a magazine called Money Week, and I joked about it. Well, I didn't really joke. I was just pointing out that they typically just
talk about gold.
Yeah, that's it, Andy. I said, they basically would just say buy gold, don't buy property. Well, Mark forwarded me an email as well, which I actually burst out laughing when I read it. And he'd said, look, I heard your podcast and I've just received this in my inbox. And he shared it with me. And the headline was basically why you should buy gold and not property. And it was from Money Week. And so it just summed up exactly what I said, that they're very, it could have been better, but it's quite good fun to try and spot the agenda of nearly every magazine that you read or newspaper. There's always an underlying one. But anyway, going back to what Mark said, he called BT out basically, and BT raised his price. He'd been in a 18-month contract, and after 12 months, they increased his price from £42 to £56. This was for TV and broadband, and he's thinking, why have they done that? So anyway, he contacted them, and it turns out that they went, oh, sorry, that was a mistake. I'm not quite sure how that can occur. They mistakenly increased his pricing, and therefore he got a refund. So there you go. There's a moral in that story. If you're not sure, always ask, because as Mark's just found out, that it can be a mistake. But another one is Hargreaves Lansdown are a company that they're one of the biggest platforms out there, and they have big plus points. I mean, in terms of their infrastructure, their app, the amount of choice they have, and their customer service, and they are the most popular platform in the UK. And to a certain extent you can understand why, but there are things that aren't so great about them. For example, when you try and leave them, as I've mentioned on the podcast in the past, they will charge you £25 per line of stock, they call it. So let's say you had 5 funds, they would charge you £125 per fund if you were to transfer those funds elsewhere. Now, there is a way around it. You basically move into cash, or you reduce the number of funds you have and you can reduce that fee. Now, not all platforms have exit fees, others do though, so Best Invest is one, so they're not alone in this exit fee ploy. But one of the things with Mark, he decided to move some of his stuff away, and it was partly because it was with Vanguard, and Vanguard have got their own platform, and it's therefore cheaper. You understand that. But then, it was only because he looked at his account that he'd been charged about £600 by Hargreaves, and when he looked into it, mistakenly so, when he should have been charged maybe £125, which he would have agreed with, they'd somehow come to this charge where they assumed he was closing his entire account, despite the fact he still had money there. Now, as he pointed out, if he'd had the cash that the fee would have been taken, he probably would have been none the wiser, because it would have just gone out and he wouldn't have noticed it. But he did notice it because he still had funds left and the charge was sitting on the account. So the message from Mark really is to check everything, particularly when you leave somewhere. Now I want to give you 2 other examples, because EE, the mobile phone company, they have a friends and family discount, and there was a case that was publicised in one of the national newspapers where somebody left and they had to pay out the remaining part of their contract because they'd signed up for a 24-month deal, but they also had to pay back effectively the 30% discount that was going to be on the deal that they'd already enjoyed. So what it meant is they had to pay a ridiculous sum of money. I think it was a couple £100 to quit EE. Now, obviously, the newspaper was up in arms, but it was actually in the terms of the contract, which I know doesn't feel right, but you have to be careful, because if you enjoy a loyalty bonus or a loyalty discount of some kind from a product, you need to make sure you understand what will happen when you leave. And it's a good example of where the loyalty discount is great, but as soon as you leave, you're going to be penalised and it'll cost you more. Now, this person, I think, was moving abroad, so they really didn't want the product anymore. So the other one that I would say is admin fees on insurances. Now, if you have a regular monthly insurance, you think, I want to cancel this policy. Exiting a policy midway through a term, maybe it's your house insurance or travel insurance, whatever it is, there will normally be a fee they apply to it. So you have to make sure you know what it is and taking that into account if you're trying to switch products. And the final one I want to point out, which is one that has been a massive irritant to me personally, is when you switch energy companies. Now, while there may not necessarily be an exit charge, there can be. The thing that's really got me in the past with switching energy providers is, despite me giving them accurate meter readings, I've then gone back historically and worked out they've used an estimate to work out my final bill, which coincidentally wiped all the credit off of my account. Now, I wasn't as conscientious as Mark, and it was one of those things that I needed. I once I noticed it, I needed to chase it, and it was a few years ago, and I never got round to it, and I kicked myself for it ever since. So when I've switched energy providers since, I've been a real stickler for finding that bill, because obviously they email them to you often, and they're going down and seeing what they'd used, because you give them meter readings and they're meant to pass them between the new provider and the old provider, but it hasn't happened in the past, and for whatever the rules say what should happen and what shouldn't happen, the fact is it does, and I no doubt lost money out of it. So do beware. So if you're leaving a product, beware of any exit fees, or if you're actually entering into a new contract that's got some good discounts, do be mindful of what will happen when you no longer want the product. And if there's any overcharging, question why it occurs and get them to explain it to you, because it could be wrong.
Really good tips. Love it. Love it, love it, love it. Okay, so if you want to get in touch with Damien and feature on next week's podcast, of course, you can do so. It's at Money to the Masses, and that's money 2 with the number 2, the masses, on Twitter. If you want to get in touch on email, it's Damien@moneytothemasses.com. Anything else, Damien?
Go Google Crohn's disease. That's what you got to do.
When you said Google Chrome, I thought you were talking about Google Chrome, the browser.
Use Google Chrome to Google Crohn's. That should be their new marketing campaign, Andy. We've missed our calling in life. If we give up on podcasts, we can go into marketing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Love that. Okay, until next time.
Until next time.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.